Well, I'm just going to begin by asking if you were aware prior to getting sort of involved in this whole project and coming up with this idea, just how dangerous a year 1981 was in New York City.
I was, that whole era, I lived in New Jersey, which is a suburb of New York City, so I lived about 50 minutes outside of New York City. So certainly, my dad worked in town and would travel in there every day, and when we would go in to visit him in the 70s and 80s, I was a little kid, but old enough. I was 7, 8 years old, and it was, you did not do things that you do now in New York City. You went directly to where you were going. You didn't walk out late at night. I mean, there were people's lives were totally changed by this horrible slide into violence during the 70s. But to kind of get back into it, I started looking at different crime statistics, and there is this just horrible, fascinating, curve of violent crime just increasing every year from the late 60s through 1981. And this was, for the most part, by most measurements, the most violent year on record in New York City history.
I mean, it's a bit of a sort of cliche to say so, but I mean, New York is very much a character in this movie in a sense that if anything, it's actually the leading antagonist. That's one of my favorite things about it. Would you say that the biggest villain in this is a kind of damaged society?
Yeah, the fear, so when there's an act of violence, there's obviously the people right at its core that are horribly directly affected. If someone shoots someone else, the victim and the accused, the person doing the crime to them, their lives are never the same, and so is the immediate circle around that. But the sort of more drastic effect on society as a whole, or a city or a country, is the sort of outward moving, ripples from that original act. And, after 9/11 in the United States, the sort of overreaction or reaction to that horrible event changed everyone's lives, in a way that is sort of fascinating that one act can do that. So the city at this time, forced people to entirely change the way they had been living their lives. And these characters are living, a far less rich life than they were because simply you could not do things that you, that you used to be able to do. And I think much to the detriment of the entire city, basically.
Your first film had this exceptional, really sharp screenplay, which obviously you were deservedly nominated for an Oscar for. And then the second one had barely any dialogue.
Yes.
Did this feel a bit more like a middle ground between the two?
It did, and that I'm flat out willing to admit. So this was really the most traditionally structured film, that I had taken on, and it almost, very much I was aware that I was recreating, I was kind of using the structure of a traditional Hollywood gangster film, from either the 30s or the 70s, all the sort of that pattern of the film was one that I was trying to then bring another, a character study into. So I'm hopefully taking you on that wild ride that those films, take you on. But in the end, you're realizing these are people actually turning left when you think they're turning right, or turning right when you think they're going to go left.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest influence I could sort of take from it was Chinatown. That was the film that I saw
the good news, my 20s were spent watching every film on planet Earth. Once I get the last 5 or 6 years since I've really been doing, making films full time, I try to kind of have the memories of films that I love in my head, but I don't actually, I admire a couple of the filmmakers I admire the most, watch every film in a genre before they're going to tackle it. I sort of do the exact opposite. I'm writing just from where the story kind of takes me. And so this film was sort of most inspired actually by the still photography being done by a large group of street photographers that were just exploding at this time in New York City. And I probably looked at 4,000 or 5,000 pictures of different work from this period. And but the DNA of those movies is certainly there, and hopefully you as an audience member are kind of being misled by some of those preconceived notions of who these people are and what they actually do.
And I mean, when it comes to sort of writing a screenplay, it must one of the most rewarding experiences, I imagine, is to see actors bring it to life. And
yeah.
I mean, you've got three of the best actors working today in Oscar Isaac, Jessica Chastain, and David Oyelowo, I think.
Yeah.
It must have been just a joy to watch them bring your creations to the big screen.
Yeah, I mean, my films are fairly baked by the time I've written the script. I see where I want them to be. I know what that world is, and they've been bouncing around in my head for years usually before I ever actually get them down on paper. So the writing process the actual physical writing process is often fairly brutal because you almost have it in your head and it's just a matter of getting it down on page. But then a couple months later or a couple years later, depending on how long it takes, to actually have those words sort of be reinterpreted, brought to life, improved, and in some cases you don't even know that's what you were saying. It's in there, obviously, but I didn't know that's what I was doing until you're sitting in front of a monitor and then you watch an actor or actress like these guys bring it to life, and they've figured out what you were actually really trying to get at. And you know, there's nothing much cooler than that for me in my business, having these guys going at it. You know, those are three, I mean, everyone in this film, but the three of those guys right now, I feel like are operating at the sort of highest, most finely tuned level. And it's pretty beautiful to watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey, you guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yeah.
Nice.
Hey!